Can a circuit that was your strength to become your worst nightmare? Ferrari arrives in Singapore with a pending debt, a car full of defects, and a pressure that is already unbearable. But do they really have any real opportunity to shine? Ferrari arrives in Singapore with more than a car, arrives with an open wound that has not closed throughout the season. What should be an opportunity to overcome is now presented as an existential threat to its 2025 campaign. Marina Bay was always a circuit that rewarded precision, patience, and mechanical traction, all characteristics that, in the past, Ferrari knew how to capitalize. But this year, the Scuderia loads with a car that seems to punish any attempt of optimism. The SF-25, more than a racing car, has become an inexhaustible source of doubts. Every weekend of Grand Prix has been a battle not only against the rivals, but against the machinery itself. What Ferrari showed in pre-season training, where the car seemed to respond well in long batches and showed aerodynamic consistency, has vanished in the reality of the races. The adaptation of the car to the different paths has been erratic, and in places where they should have shown, such as in Baku or Australia, their setup or operational configuration failures have relegated them to secondary papers. But what makes Singapore a critical point is not only its story with Ferrari, but its current context. This circuit does not tolerate imperfections. Each curve, each braking, demands absolute confidence in the balance of the car and an impeccable thermal performance. And that is precisely the great weakness of the SF-25. Its performance window is so reduced that any variation as the asphalt temperature, tire pressure, or environmental humidity can ruin the entire weekend. To that we must add the extreme conditions of the weather. Singapore is probably the most physically demanding circuit of the calendar. With temperatures that touch the 31 degrees, a humidity that exceeds 70%, and races that exceed 2 hours, the wear of tires, brakes, and the pilots themselves becomes a decisive factor. And when your car is already suffering with thermal management, especially in the middle and soft compounds, this type of environment not only aggravates the problems, it exposes them publicly. There is nowhere to hide in Singapore. In addition, this Grand Prix has a symbolic burden. Ferrari needs to send a message both to his rivals and themselves. The internal pressure is not less. Lewis Hamilton, newcomer to the team, has demonstrated adaptation capacity, but even he has stumbled upon the inconsistencies of the SF-25. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, is obliged to demonstrate technical leadership in a team that has not yet found a clear direction. Marina Bay is not just a career, it is a statement. Oh, the SF-25 is claimed, or the failure of this season will be sealed long before the last race. At this time, Ferrari no longer fights for points. Fight for its credibility, for its narrative, and to keep alive the hope that this 2025 project was not born broken from the base. Singapore is the turning point. And if they fail here, it will be very difficult to recover the psychological, technical, and competitive terrain in the remainder of the calendar. The Ferrari SF-25 is, without exaggeration, one of the most temperamental cars that Maranello has produced in recent years. And the most alarming is not its lack of pure performance, but chronic instability in its behavior. This car may seem fast on a practical Friday and unrecognizable on Saturday afternoon. And that is not due to casualties or external circumstances, but to a technical architecture that has proven to be as unstable. In an attempt to find a new development route, Ferrari left several bases that had defined their recent identity. Changing in pushrod front suspension to a pull rod was a risky decision. The intention was to gain aerodynamic efficiency in the flow that feeds the car, a critical area in the soil effect. But this redesign brought with it an extremely sensitive package to configuration changes, to the point that a few millimeters in the body's height can completely ruin the general balance. And that sensitivity has become his worst enemy. What for other teams represents a flexible work window, for Ferrari is a tightrope. There is no margin of error. Engineers have had to operate the car as if it were an experimental prototype, constantly correcting and remaking configurations that, in theory, should work replicably. But the SF-25 does not respond consistently. It can have an excellent rhythm in long batches one day, and lose all its balance by changing compound or environmental conditions. Subwiring problems, for example, have not been a simple trend, but a structural limitation. The car loses front grip in medium-speed curves, forcing pilots to modify their driving style. Leclerc, especially, has had to make extreme adjustments, sacrificing its natural instinct of late braking and aggressive entry, to adopt a more conservative trace, with earlier braking and greater softness in weight transfer. This type of adaptation, although admirable, is a symptom of the general imbalance that Ferrari has failed to correct from the first races. Lewis Hamilton, meanwhile, has begun a similar adaptation process, but with an evident level of frustration. The British, accustomed to stable cars and with a wider window of operation in his time in Mercedes, has had to face a more steep learning curve than expected. Even with all his experience, he has confessed that he still fails to feel completely integrated to the behavior of the car, and that any change in temperature, wind, or height of the asphalt radically affects the response of the SF-25. In parallel, thermal problems have become a constant threat. The SF-25 has a critical tendency to overheat rear tires, especially under medium-low speed conditions or in slow curve sequences. This characteristic not only compromises traction, but also prevents any type of aggressiveness in the strategy. In urban circuits such as Singapore, where the rhythm is built based on precise traction and conservation of the compound, this is a tactical death sentence. The Singapore Grand Prix represents much more than a simple race within the calendar for Ferrari. It is, in essence, the last real opportunity that the team has to justify the enormous effort invested in the SF-25 project. And it's not just points, not even championship aspirations. It is about dignity, reputation, sending a clear signal to the paddock and its own fans that this car, with all its limitations, can still compete. And if you do not do it in Singapore, you can hardly do so in the remaining paths of the calendar. Marina Bay demands surgical precision. There are no generous escapes, there is no room for errors. Every centimeter counts. It is a circuit where the tuning of the car becomes an exact science and where the simulations must be almost prophetic to anticipate the evolution of the asphalt, the appearance of safety cars, and the inevitable degradation of the rear tire. Here, more than anywhere else, teams cannot improvise. And that is a problem for Ferrari because SF-25 has been the most unpredictable car of the season. The greatest danger to Ferrari is not that the car is slow, but does not respond consistently to any controllable variable. The extreme heat of Singapore, added to constant humidity and to the fact that it runs at night, creates an ideal scenario to expose the thermal weaknesses of the SF-25. The trend to overheating rear tires in prolonged traction conditions, as in Marina Bay, where pilots spend more than 70% of the lap in areas of acceleration and lateral load, is exactly the type of stress that this car cannot handle stable. In addition, Singapore route is infamous for punishing strategic errors. The team that reacts late to a yellow flag, or that underestimates the optimal stop window, can be struggling through a podium to fall out of the points in a single round. And Ferrari, who has managed to improve in his procedures regarding past seasons, has not yet demonstrated this year the ability to execute strategies without compromises. The operational pressure will be maximum, and any failure will be amplified by the environment. But beyond the technical, there is an impossible psychological factor to ignore. This race is a character proof for the entire team. For Leclerc, it represents the opportunity to recover the initiative within the team after having been overshadowed in some sessions by a rapid ascent Hamilton. For Lewis, it is a way to consolidate his role as the new spiritual leader of the project. If any of them manages to shine under the lights of Marina Bay, you can change the narrative of the year, transform the accumulated frustration into a history of redemption. And in the context of the championship, although the numbers no longer favor a miraculous comeback, the performance in Singapore can redefine the role that Ferrari will play in the final part of the season. If the SF-25 finds here a solid basis of competitiveness, it can become the decisive factor to interfere in the fight for the title between McLaren, Red Bull, and Mercedes. But if it fails, the team runs the risk of being dragged into an irrelevant second half, where they will only fight to save appearances. There is no maneuvering room. Ferrari cannot afford more mediocre action. Singapore is not simply one more race on the list. It is a sentence. A definitive response on whether SF-25 has some competitive future in this season or if it will be remembered as another example of a breach. It is the last letter. And it is on the table. And so, I want to invite you to reflect with me. Are we really facing Ferrari's last chance? Do you think the SF-25 still has potential to redeem in a layout as complex as Marina Bay? Or do you think the team should already focus their efforts on the 2026 season? Because there is something that is clear. What happens in Singapore will mark a before and after in this narrative. As a fan, what decisions should they make in Maranello if the car fails again? Should they change the radical technical approach they took? Or simply accept that this season is lost and rebuild from scratch? And if this analysis was useful to you, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe, activate notifications, and share it with other F1 fans helps us to continue growing this channel.